in what way is Christ being sacrificed in the Mass? I understand this sacrifice is not bloody and that his sacrifice on Calvary was sufficient. Beyond that, I am confused. Thanks, Katie.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to explain it to you, but I also want to recommend that you read Pius XII's encyclical Mediator Dei.
Okay.
All right, in which I'm going to try to find the text right now, actually, while I'm talking to you.
Where would she find that text?
Here we go, I've just found it. She could just type in Mediator Dei online in any search engine and find it at the Vatican's website.
Okay.
All right. And if you happen to live near a Catholic library, you could go get it in a collection of the Pope's encyclicals.
Probably
the easiest way is just to pull it offline.
Sure, it's probably on the EWTN site as well.
Now, so here's what the Pope says, and he's reflecting. He's not giving his own opinion on this. He's reflecting 2,000 years of Catholic theological reflection on the nature of the sacrifice of the holy sacrifice of the Mass.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that the death of Christ occurs only once. It occurs on Calvary 2,000 years ago. Okay.
Okay.
And we know that Christ is really present in the sacrifice of the altar, in the holy sacrifice of the Mass, in the Eucharist, body, blood, soul, and divinity. He's really there. Okay. Now, here's a question for you. The Christ who's present on the altar, is it Christ in his proper person as he really lives right now at the right hand of the Father? Or is it the Christ who died on the cross 2,000 years ago? In other words, in the Mass, is there some form of time travel happening, right? Or is it just a translation in space?
Yeah.
All right. And the dogmatic answer is it's not time travel. The Christ who's present on the Mass is the glorified Christ in heaven at the right hand of the Father.
Okay.
Christ as he is in his proper person right now. All right. And tomorrow when we say Mass, or when the priest says Mass, it'll be Christ tomorrow.
Right now.
Right then. Okay?
Right then. Yeah,
St. Thomas Aquinas addresses this in a really peculiar way. He asks in the Summa Theologica a hypothetical question. Of course, this didn't actually happen, but he just, for purposes of illustration, he says, if the apostles had celebrated Mass when Christ was in the tomb, when he had died and his human body was in the tomb, what would have been present in the Mass? And Thomas concludes that you would have had the divinity, body and blood of Jesus, but not his human soul.
Okay.
Because at that moment, his human soul had descended to the dead, right, to redeem those that were kept awaiting the coming of the Lord. Okay, and that being physically dead, physical death means the separation of soul and body. All right, it's properly the sacrament of body and blood. All right. We get the soul along with the body and blood because the soul, Christ is alive now. Body, blood comes along. I mean, soul comes along, and of course, divinity also. All right, but you wouldn't have the human soul. So that illustrates how realistically the Church understands the immediacy of Christ's presence. It's Christ right now. What are we? July 14th, right?
Yes, sir.
It's right now, Jesus in heaven, July 14th, at about, say, 1:07 Central Time. That's the Jesus who would be made present on the altar right now if we were to confect the Mass, if a priest were to confect the Mass right now, which some priest is doing someplace in the world right now, by the way. Okay. Now, so it's in no way is Christ being immolated in the Mass. All right, he's not. It's not the Christ of 2,000 years ago that's being immolated in the Mass. Not Christ today. In what manner is the immolation? Now, I want to be very clear. Jesus is really, truly, substantially present in the Mass, but his death is not.
Okay,
all right, that's the point of it. He's really present. His death is not.
Okay.
In what manner is the death present? Only in the symbolic or figurative representation of his death, illustrated through the separate consecration of bread and wine. Bread obviously is a symbol for body, blood a symbol for wine, because it's a sacrament. The things that are symbolized are really there. Body and blood are really there, right? But they are represented in a state of victimhood, namely separation. So the immolation of the Mass is symbolic only, but the body and blood are not only symbolically, but truly and substantially present.
Got it.
Okay, so that's very important. That's the relationship between Calvary and the Mass. Now, how it's a sacrifice, it's the same sacrifice as Calvary in three respects. It is the same priest who offers it. Christ who offered his own body and blood on the cross at Calvary, does so again through the ministration of his priest, because the intent and the mind of the priest is to offer the same sacrifice. Same priest offers the sacrifice. The same victim is present, first in a bloody manner, now in an unbloody manner.
All right.
Okay. And third, for the same intent, for the same purpose, namely the reparation for sin and the salvation of the world. All right. But the church teaches it is the same sacrifice specifically, but not numerically. So each holy sacrifice of the Mass is a distinct sacrifice that can be offered for a distinct intention.
I don't know if I misunderstood his answer. The way I saw the holy sacrifice of the Mass, or the way I was taught, is Jesus, we're not re-sacrificing him, but we are at the bloody sacrifice of the crucifixion, because he is outside of time. So we're at the Last Supper, we're at the crucifixion, because he's not governed by time, but we are. But the Mass is outside of time. Okay,
I understand that theory, and I'll give you a place where it's definitively rejected, so that I'm not just speaking in my own words. If you go to Ludwig Ott's book, The Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, and read the section on the relationship between Calvary and the Mass, what you have just articulated is called the mystical view of the relationship of Calvary to the Mass. And Ott, who's a Catholic dogmatician and expert in fundamental theology, holds that that theory, which was first floated in the 19th century during the liturgical movement, was definitively rejected by Pius XII in the encyclical Mediator Dei. Okay?
All right.
So this is a theory. We're getting into speculative stuff here. This is a theory about the relationship of Calvary to the Mass. Okay. Now, it's commonly held. I understand that. And one of the reasons is that there's a lot of devotional language, particularly sort of born out of the tradition of the Church's tradition of mental prayer, which is an imaginative engagement in the truths of the faith, that encourage the faithful to see themselves, as it were, there at the foot of the cross with St. John and the Blessed Virgin Mary. And in fact, the Catechism of the Catholic Church uses that language, and it will say, it is as it were, quoda modo in Latin, as it were, that we were there at the foot of the cross with the Blessed Virgin and St. John.
Okay.
But you got to lay a heavy stress on that adverb, on that qualifier, as it were, in a certain sense. In what sense? In the sense that we should recall to mind the event of the Passion. But are we actually translated in time? Are we hopping in the TARDIS and flying back? Is the sacrifice made present to us in such a manner? And this is the key question. In such a manner that the sacrifice on Calvary and the sacrifice of the Mass are numerically identical. That's the question. Are they numerically identical? And what the tradition teaches, and this is embedded in the theology of St. Thomas and in the theology of the Council of Trent, as well. If you want to look at Pius X's Catechism, it's very explicit there. In the Baltimore Catechism from the American Church, as well as in the encyclical of Pius XII, is that Calvary and the Mass are specifically the same sacrifice, in that it's the same priest, the same victim, offered for the same intent. All right? Yep. But they are numerically distinct. They are numerically distinct. Okay? Now, I've got Mediator Dei in front of me, and so I'm now quoting the Pope, all right, who describes the manner in which the death of Christ is present in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Pope Pius XII writes, "Thus, the commemorative representation of his death, which actually took place on Calvary, is repeated in every sacrifice of the altar, seeing that Jesus Christ is symbolically shown by separate symbols to be in a state of victimhood." So the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ are really, truly, and substantially present in the holy sacrifice of the Mass through transubstantiation, but it is the proper person of Christ, in his proper person today in heaven, who's made present. The death of Christ is not made present, except insofar as he is symbolically shown by separate symbols to be in a state of victimhood. So it's a symbolic immolation, but a true and substantial presence of body and blood. The theory that you articulated, I know that one is commonly held, but it's actually not the one embedded in Trent or Thomistic theology or in the teaching of Pius XII, and at least under Ludwig Ott's interpretation, was definitively ruled out by Pius XII. And there are good reasons to discount it. One of them is that on the theory that it's the numerically same sacrifice, it becomes less intelligible how each individual Mass could be offered for a specific intention as a distinct oblation, which is clearly the teaching of the Church, that every Mass is a distinct oblation. All right. And ironically, the mystical presence view has a sort of tangential connection to Calvinism, because that is highly analogous to the way Calvin understood the relationship of what he called the Lord's Supper to Calvary. All right, and so ironically, it's sort of tilting in Protestant directions, whereas the Catholic view emphasizes very heavily that each individual Mass is a distinct oblation and a sacrifice in which the victim, Christ Himself, is really and truly present on the altar, offered at that moment as a distinct act of worship and sacrifice, effected by the minister, but offered by the whole Church.